There is a city in the rainforest of northern Guatemala that was once home to something in the range of 100,000 people. And if you stand at the base of one of its temples today and look out across the canopy, you can see for miles in every direction without seeing a single thing that the people who built it would recognize. The forest has come back. The plazas are buried. The roads that once connected this city to dozens of other cities across the lowland peninsula are indistinguishable now from the forest floor. And the last monument commissioned by the last king of this place was carved in stone approximately 1,200 years ago, after which the stone carvers simply stopped and the king stopped commissioning things, and the city that had taken centuries to build began, quietly and without drama, to be reclaimed by the trees. The city is called Tikal. What happened to it happened to nearly every major city in the southern Maya lowlands within roughly the same century and a half, a silence spreading across a network of interconnected cities like a tide going out, and the question of what caused that silence is one of the most carefully studied and still most contested mysteries in the archaeology of the ancient Americas. The answers, when you trace them carefully, turn out to be less like a single cause and more like a weather system, a convergence of pressures that had been building for generations, and sitting with that complexity is what this story is for. Before we continue, if stories told this slowly are what you come here for, subscribing to the channel means the next one will find you when it is ready. There is no better company for this particular kind of night than the history of places that have been quietly waiting for someone to sit with them. Now, let us go in. It is early morning in the rainforest of the Petin, the flat lowland basin of northern Guatemala, where the Maya built some of their largest cities, and the mist is doing what mist does here at this hour, rising from the forest floor in pale columns that drift between the trees and catch the first indirect light before the sun has fully cleared the canopy. The sound is all birdsong and insect noise and the occasional creak of a very large tree settling in the cooling air. And somewhere in the middle distance, just visible above the tree line, a stone structure rises, its upper courses still above the canopy, pale and ancient and patient. The air smells of wet earth and rotting wood and something drier underneath, the mineral smell of old limestone. And if you stand here quietly enough and long enough, the distinction between the forest and the ruins begins to dissolve, which is perhaps the most honest way to understand what this place has become. The light is coming slowly. That is the first thing you notice about this time of day in the rainforest. The slowness of the transition from dark to pale, the way the canopy filters the arriving daylight into something diffuse and directional and soft, falling unevenly through the gaps between the largest trees and pooling in the lower vegetation before it reaches the ground. At ground level, even when the sky above the canopy is fully light, the forest floor remains in a kind of attenuated dusk, crossed by shafts of more direct light where a large tree has fallen and left a gap, and the contrast between those bright pools and the surrounding green shadow is one of the defining visual qualities of this landscape, a quality that paintings and photographs consistently fail to capture because it is inseparable from being in 3 dimensions inside it. The sounds shift as the light changes, the pre-dawn chorus, which in this forest is extraordinary in its complexity and volume. A wall of sound produced by dozens of species simultaneously, as though the forest were announcing the day to itself, has given way to the more scattered calls of individual birds going about their specific morning business. And underneath the bird song, there is the constant background hum of insects that is the sonic baseline of this ecosystem at all hours. The structure in the middle distance has not moved, which is a strange thing to note but is somehow relevant. Everything else in this landscape is in motion, the birds and the insects and the mist and the light. And the stone above the tree line sits in all of that motion completely still, a stillness that it has maintained for more than 1,200 years. Something happened here. The stone says so. The forest does not disagree. What it knows about what happened here is different from what the stone knows, but neither of them is in a hurry to explain, and there is no better hour than this one, in this particular quality of early light, to begin asking. The Petan is not easy country. This is worth understanding before anything else because it shapes everything about what was built here and what happened to it. The lowland Maya basin is hot and humid and flat, a limestone shelf that drains poorly, covered in a forest so dense that from the ground you can rarely see more than a few dozen meters in any direction. And the soil beneath that forest is thin and acidic and exhausted quickly when cleared for agriculture. There are no major rivers in this part of the lowlands. The water that falls as rain either runs off or soaks through the porous limestone into underground channels, and the surface topography offers very little in the way of natural lakes or streams that could serve a large settled population through a dry season. It is, in short, exactly the kind of landscape that the conventional wisdom about where civilizations develop would have predicted would remain empty. And yet it did not remain empty. It did not remain empty because the Maya, across several centuries of experimentation and adaptation, beginning well before the Common Era, found ways to manage water and agriculture in this landscape that were considerably more sophisticated than anything the landscape's apparent limitations would have suggested. They built reservoirs, large engineered catchment basins that collected rainwater during the wet season and stored it through the dry months, some of them substantial enough to supply a city of tens of thousands of people through a prolonged dry period. They built raised agricultural fields in the swampy areas on the edges of seasonal wetlands, mounded platforms of soil separated by drainage channels that allowed crops to grow in conditions that would otherwise have been too waterlogged to cultivate. They managed the forest itself with a care and deliberateness that we are only beginning to understand through the analysis of ancient pollen cores and charcoal deposits. What they built in this landscape, over roughly 1,000 years of occupation before the period we're going to spend most of our time in, was a civilization of extraordinary complexity and reach, the classic period of Maya civilization, running from roughly the 3rd century to the 9th century of the Common Era, produced cities that were not simply large but architecturally ambitious, politically sophisticated, and culturally rich, in ways that scholarship has been struggling to adequately describe ever since European explorers first encountered the ruins in the 19th century and found themselves unable to reconcile what they were seeing with the assumptions they had brought about. Who could build such things? To understand what was lost, you have to begin by understanding what was there. And the chronological anchor matters here because the Maya classic period was not happening at the margins of the ancient world, but at its center, in the sense that the most significant things were happening wherever people were living most fully and most completely, which was not a European monopoly. At roughly the same moment that Charlemagne was consolidating his fractious empire in northern Europe, and at the same moment that the Tang dynasty in China was producing some of the most refined poetry and painting and ceramics in human history, Maya cities in the southern lowlands were doing things that have no parallel anywhere in the pre-Columbian Americas and very few parallels anywhere else. They were computing calendrical cycles that extended millions of years into the past and equally far into the future. They were tracking the movements of Venus with a precision that allowed them to predict its appearances as a morning star to within a fraction of a day. They were building astronomical alignments into their architecture in ways that required sustained observation across generations. And they were recording all of this, and the histories of their kings and their wars and their marriages and their sacrifices, in a writing system of genuine phonetic sophistication that would remain substantially undeciphered until the middle of the 20th century. That last point deserves a moment. The decipherment of Maya writing is one of the great intellectual achievements of the past 100 years, and the people who accomplished it deserve to be understood as more than names attached to scholarly footnotes. Tatiana Proskouriakov was a Russian-American architect and archaeologist who spent much of her career drawing meticulous reconstructions of Maya sites, and in 1960 she published a paper demonstrating something that many of her colleagues had considered impossible: that the figures depicted on Maya monuments were not abstract priests or mythological beings, but actual historical rulers, real people, whose births and accessions to power and marriages and military victories and deaths were recorded in stone with a specificity that, once you understood what you were looking at, read like royal biography. Her insight transformed Maya studies. Before Proskouriakov, the classic Maya were often imagined as a civilization of peaceful astronomer priests, their cities ceremonial centers rather than genuine cities, their monuments records of cosmic time rather than human history. After her, the monuments became what they actually were: the propaganda of real kings competing with each other in stone as their armies competed in the field. David Stewart came later, in a generation of scholars who built on the foundations Proskouriakov had established. Stewart began working on Maya inscriptions as a teenager, with an intuitive facility for visual pattern recognition that produced insights his more formally trained colleagues sometimes struggled to follow, and he went on to make fundamental contributions to the phonetic decipherment of the writing system, demonstrating the grammatical and linguistic structures that allowed the glyphs to be read, just as historical records but as literature, as language in the full sense. His work, and the work of the community of scholars around him, is ongoing. The Maya texts are not yet fully understood, but they are being read, and what they reveal, year by year, is a civilization of far greater complexity and humanity than any earlier account had managed to convey. The Maya political world that these inscriptions describe was not an empire. This is a crucial thing to understand, because empire implies a kind of centralized control, a single power extending its authority across a large territory. That was never the structure of the classic Maya lowlands. What existed instead was a mosaic, hundreds of polities, ranging from small towns with local lords to large city-states with populations of tens of thousands and territories extending over thousands of square kilometers, each with its own ruling dynasty claiming descent from founding ancestors or patron deities, each with its own title and its own set of alliances and enmities, operating within a shared cultural and religious framework that was recognizably Maya across the entire lowland region, but that expressed itself differently in every city and every court. The great cities of the classic period were not simply administrative centers. They were cosmological statements, built to embody the structure of the world as the Maya understood it, with their main temples oriented to astronomical events and their plazas arranged according to principles that expressed the relationship between the human and the divine. The kings who ruled these cities were not simply political leaders, but ritual specialists, men whose primary responsibility was to perform the ceremonies that maintained the cosmic order, whose bodies were the meeting point between the human world and the world of the gods, whose blood was the sacrifice that fed the forces that kept the sun moving and the rains coming and the maize growing. The political and the religious were not separate spheres in classic Maya life. They were the same sphere, and the cities were where that sphere was most fully and most publicly expressed. The trade networks that connected these cities were extensive and complex, running not just across the Maya lowlands but out to the highlands of Guatemala and the coast of the Gulf of Mexico and the distant sources of jade and obsidian and cacao and the feathers of quetzal birds that were essential to Maya ritual life. Goods moved along these routes in quantities that required sophisticated organization, and the roads, the saperbs, the white limestone causeways that ran through the forest connecting cities and their satellite communities were an infrastructure of considerable engineering achievement, some of them running for dozens of kilometers and built to a standard that allowed heavy goods to be moved reliably, regardless of the wet season mud. The political relationships between these cities were not simply those of competition and conflict, though competition and conflict were certainly part of the picture. Alliances were formed and maintained through royal marriages, which placed members of one dynasty's family in the court of another and created webs of obligation that could last for generations. Subordinate cities paid tribute to dominant ones and received protection in return. A relationship that gave the larger cities a reliable flow of labor and goods, and gave the smaller ones a degree of security they couldn't maintain alone. The great cities of the lowlands had patron-client networks, extending across hundreds of kilometers, with the politics of the entire region organized partly around which of the major powers a given city was affiliated with, how strong that affiliation was, and what the cost of breaking it might be. Calakmul and Tikal, the two largest cities of the Classic period, conducted a rivalry for regional dominance that played out through proxy wars, alliance switching, and the patronage of competing factions in smaller cities, a geopolitical contest that shaped the history of the lowlands for centuries and that we can now trace in remarkable detail through the inscriptions that record its moments of triumph and defeat. By the early decades of the 8th century, roughly 1200 years ago, this world was at its most elaborate and most confident. The monuments being commissioned by Maya kings were increasingly elaborate and increasingly politically pointed, each one a claim about a dynasty's legitimacy and its relationships with other dynasties. The stone records of a political culture that was conducting a great deal of its competition through the medium of public art. The cities were large, their populations pressing against the limits of what the landscape could sustain, their agricultural systems intensifying to feed more people than the lowlands had ever supported before. The calendar priests were computing, the architects were designing, the trade routes were busy. Nothing in the record, so far as we can read it now, announced what was coming. Tikal in the 7th century was not quiet. This is worth saying first, because the experience of visiting the site today, in its forest silence with the trees growing through the plazas and the howler monkeys announcing dawn from the upper platforms of the temples, creates an impression of stillness and remoteness that has nothing to do with what the place was during the centuries of its greatest power. The great temples that are visible for miles above the forest were not isolated monuments rising from an empty landscape. They were the visible peaks of a city, and the city was everywhere around them, in the plazas below the temples where thousands of people gathered for ceremonies, in the markets where goods from across the lowlands and beyond were bought and sold, in the residential compounds that spread in every direction, from the ceremonial core, in the agricultural fields and wetland gardens and orchards that extended through the forest for kilometers beyond the city's center, feeding a population that may have reached somewhere between 60,000 and 100,000 people at the city's height in the late 7th and early 8th centuries. The temple visible from the distance is Temple I, the temple of the Great Jaguar, a stepped pyramid that rises nearly 50 meters above the plaza floor, its 9 terraces representing the 9 levels of the Maya underworld. its summit temple accessible by a staircase so steep that it requires hands as well as feet to ascend. The view from the top extending across the canopy in every direction to a horizon that in the clear dry season air would have included the tops of other temples from other cities. Visible reminders that Tikal was not alone in the world, but the center of a network that stretched across the entire southern lowland basin. The temple was commissioned by a king known to us as Jasar Kawil, who ruled Tikal in the late 7th century and is the most prominent figure in the site's recent history. The king, who broke the long domination of Kalakmul's alliance over Tikal's political fortunes and restored the city to a position of regional supremacy. He was buried in the temple he commissioned. The tomb was intact when archaeologists found it in the 20th century, and what it contained, the jade, the carved bone, the ceramic vessels, the offerings that accompany the king into the underworld, gave us some of the most precise picture we have of how a classic Maya ruler of the highest rank understood his own death and what came after it. The scale of what Tikal accomplished in purely material terms is worth dwelling on before moving to anything more abstract. The volume of stone moved and shaped in the construction of Tikal's main temples. The 9 terraces of Temple I, the twin pyramid complexes that mark the completion of each 20-year calendrical cycle called a cartoon, the great causeways that ran from the city's core to its outlying plazas, represents a sustained mobilization of human labor across generations that has no equivalent anywhere in Fistamore, pre-Columbian lowlands, and very few equivalents anywhere in the ancient world. The causeway system alone, the saps that ran through the forests connecting the city's plazas to its satellite communities and to the roads that led to other cities, required the quarrying and transport and careful placement of enormous quantities of limestone rubble topped with polished white plaster, creating raised roads that stayed passable through the wet season and that served both the practical purpose of moving people and goods and the ceremonial purpose of providing the routes along which processions moved and along which the spatial relationships between the city's different centers were made physically navigable. What made Tikal Tikal, more than any particular monument or any particular king, was the system. The city worked because it had solved over generations the logistical problems that make large settlements in difficult environments impossible to sustain. The reservoirs that stored water through the dry season were not simply pits in the ground, but engineered catchment systems that directed runoff from the plazas and causeways into holding basins lined with plaster to prevent seepage. The geometry of the city itself functioning as a water collection apparatus, at the same time it functioned as a ceremonial space. The agricultural system that fed the population combined intensive cultivation in the wetland gardens near the city with managed forest production further out. Orchard gardens that produced fruit and wood and fiber in quantities that required careful planning and sustained labor to maintain. Nothing about this was improvised. It represented centuries of accumulated knowledge about how to make this specific landscape produce what the people living in it needed, and it worked reliably enough that the population kept growing and the city kept expanding and the monuments kept getting larger. The population that inhabited Tikal and its surrounding region was not organized simply into rulers and ruled. They're the inscriptions that survive emphasize the ruler's perspective so heavily that it can seem that way from a distance. The classic Maya social order included a substantial nobility, the Sahal and Ahor class, whose members served as administrators and military commanders and minor ritual specialists, and who lived in the masonry compounds that occupied the space between the great public plazas, their houses built with the same lime plaster and corbelled vault construction as the temples, but on a smaller scale, their rotte. burials furnished with jade and imported pottery and painted ceramic vessels that speak to a comfortable and culturally rich existence. Below the nobility were the skilled specialists, the artists and scribes and architects and astronomers, whose work produced the monuments and maintained the calendar systems and designed the buildings that give classic Maya civilization its visible character. Below them, the farmers and laborers, whose collective work of feeding and building and maintaining was the foundation on which everything else rested, and whose lives are harder to reconstruct because they left fewer permanent marks. Though the agricultural field systems and the middens and the humble household shrines that archaeology has uncovered give at least a partial picture of the texture ordinary existence in the lowland cities, the ceremonial life of Tikal expressed the same quality of accumulated sophistication that its infrastructure represented. The Maya calendar system, which was not a single calendar but an interlocking set of calendrical cycles operating simultaneously and producing a combined dating system of extraordinary precision, required specialists who devoted their careers to its computation and its interpretation, and the rulers who commissioned monuments needed those specialists to identify the auspicious dates on which important events should be recorded and on which future events should be scheduled. The long count calendar, which placed each day in a sequence extending back to a mythological creation date, approximately 5,000 years before the Common Era, and forward into a future that the calendar could reach without repetition for another billions of years, was a tool of historical consciousness as well as ritual scheduling, a way of locating a king and a city in a time that extended far beyond any human lifetime in both directions. The inscriptions multiply across the lowland sites in the 7th and 8th centuries, as if the kings of the classic period were engaged in an accelerating competition to record more, to claim more, to fix more permanently in stone the details of their dynasties and their victories and their cosmic credentials. The monuments grow taller, the texts grow longer. The number of named rulers and named events that archaeology is able to track multiplies generation by generation. The written record that the Maya created in stone and on plaster and in the bark paper books, of which only 4 survive the systematic destruction of the Spanish colonial period, is a record primarily of the powerful and the royal, which is typical of ancient societies and means that we know a great deal about kings and rather less about the lives of ordinary people. But the inscriptions that Tatiana Proskoriakov's analysis unlocked, by demonstrating that the dates and the figures on monuments were recording actual historical events rather than abstract cosmic cycles, gave us something that few ancient civilizations provide in such quantity: a named, dated, personalized record of political history extending across centuries, in which individual rulers can be tracked through their accessions and their marriages and their wars and their alliances and their deaths, and in which the relationships between cities can be mapped with a granularity that allows modern scholars to reconstruct the political geography of the classic Maya lowlands in considerable detail. The depth of the historical record that Maya inscriptions provide is something that rewards sitting with. At Copan, in what is now Honduras near the Guatemalan border, the dynasty of kings that ruled from roughly the 5th century to the 9th erected a sequence of monuments recording their reigns with a biographical density that has no parallel in the pre-Columbian world outside the Maya lowlands. We know the names of 16 kings of Copan in succession. We know the dates of their accessions and their deaths. We know something about the political circumstances of their reigns, the alliances they made, the enemies they fought, the ritual performances they oversaw. The last of them, a king whose name in the glyphic record translates roughly as Yaks Parshad Chanyupat, or first dawned sky lightning god. erected the Altar Q monument that depicts all 16 kings of the dynasty seated around a square stone bench, each figure identified by his name glyph. The founder of the dynasty, passing the royal scepter to his 16th successor in an image of dynastic legitimacy and continuity that was, as we'll come to understand, commissioned at a moment when that legitimacy was already under pressure and that continuity was already in doubt. What that record shows across the centuries of the classic period's height is a world in motion. Kings were not static figures enthroned in unchanging ceremonial centers. They campaigned. They were captured and sometimes sacrificed by rivals. Their cities fought and allied and fought again. The carved monuments that recorded military victories were not merely boasts but statements of political reality, establishing in durable stone the hierarchical relationships between cities that determined the flow of tribute and the obligations of alliance, and the frequency with which those hierarchies shifted and those alliances dissolved and reformed speaks to a political environment of sustained intensity that contrasted sharply with the solidity and permanence of the architecture through which that intensity expressed itself. The cities that made up the classic Maya lowland network were not all Tikal. Most of them were considerably smaller, regional centers with populations measured in the thousands rather than the tens of thousands, whose rulers bore titles that expressed a subordinate relationship to the great powers of the region, and whose monuments recorded a more local history of marriages and accessions and the occasional military victory against nearby rivals. But even the smaller cities participated in the same cultural and political framework as the great ones, building in the same architectural tradition, using the same calendar system, performing the same ceremonies, competing in the same ball courts, recording their histories in the same writing system. The shared framework was not the product of political domination, not the forced standardization of an empire imposing its forms on subject peoples. It was the shared inheritance of a civilizational tradition that had developed over centuries across the lowland region, and it gave the Maya world a coherence and a recognizability that made it possible for ideas and goods and political relationships to flow across hundreds of kilometers with a fluency that would not have been possible if each city had been entirely its own cultural island. Copan deserves particular attention as an example of what classic Maya civilization was capable of at its furthest geographic reach, because it represents the southern and eastern extent of the lowland tradition, a city built in a highland valley in a different ecological zone from the Petian Basin, demonstrating that the Maya civilizational complex was not confined to the conditions of the central lowlands but could adapt itself to different landscapes and sustain its essential character across that adaptation. The Copan Valley is relatively small, a few kilometers wide, and the city that filled it was accordingly more compact than Tikal, but the sophistication of its architecture and its astronomical record rivals anything in the lowlands. The hieroglyphic stairway at Copan, a monumental staircase with more than 1,200 carved glyphs running up its rises, is the longest single Maya inscription known to survive, and what it records is a narrative of dynastic legitimacy that the ruling family of Copan commissioned at a moment when that legitimacy had been challenged in ways that had shaken the political order of the entire region. It was carved by people who understood that the stone would last and who were writing for posterity, which is exactly the kind of thing you do when you are not entirely sure that the present moment will survive. The ballgame courts that appear in Maya cities across the lowlands and that were not optional features of a city's layout but essential ceremonial infrastructure are one of the places where the connection between the political and the cosmic was most directly expressed. The Maya ballgame, played with a heavy rubber ball that could not be touched with hands or feet, but had to be kept in motion with the hips and torso, had mythological dimensions that connected the game to the story of the hero twins, figures from Maya cosmology who played the ball game in the underworld as part of the story of cosmic renewal that the game itself ritually enacted. Important ball games at major centers were not sporting events in the modern sense, but ceremonies, ritual performances of the mythological narrative that the architecture of the court made physically present, and the outcomes of those performances could have political consequences that reverberated beyond the ceremonial space. The jade that appears in the finest classic Maya artifacts, in the earspools and pendants and masks and mosaic burial objects that come from the tombs of major rulers, was not simply a precious material. It was the material of the maize plant, of the color of growing vegetation and flowing water, of the force of life and renewal that the Maya religious system placed at the center of its understanding of the world. A ruler adorned in jade was not simply demonstrating wealth. He was embodying the cosmological principles that his rule was supposed to maintain, making himself into a walking statement about the relationship between human political authority and the divine forces that sustain the world. The quality of workmanship in the finest Maya jade objects, some of which were carved with a precision that required sustained technical skill applied to one of the hardest naturally occurring materials in the region, is evidence of specialized artisans working over long periods with institutional support, producing objects whose function was as much theological as aesthetic. This was a civilization that had solved, repeatedly and at scale, the practical problems of feeding large populations in a difficult environment, of organizing complex political relationships across hundreds of kilometers without wheeled transport or metal tools, of recording history and astronomical observation with a precision that would not be surpassed in this hemisphere for centuries. Whatever brought it down did not bring it down from weakness. It came for something at the height of its confidence, and understanding what that was requires looking not at the collapse, but at what was there before the collapse, standing fully in the ordinary weight of its own ambition. And that is where we leave the Maya world at its height, the great cities visible from miles away above the forest canopy, the calendar priests computing forward and backward across thousands of years of time, the trade routes busy and the monuments rising, and the political system that had sustained all of this operating, as it seemed, in the way it had always operated. We can move forward now, into the middle decades of the 8th century, to the moment when the pattern that had held for so long began to develop fractures that no one at the time would have recognized as the beginning of the end. What happened next was not a single catastrophe, but a series of choices and pressures and consequences that accumulated over generations. And the place to begin understanding it is with the thing that the Maya lowland cities did to each other when the competition for resources and status and survival became more intense than the political networks that had, until then, managed to contain it. In what is now the Izabal department of eastern Guatemala, on a stretch of the Motagua River Valley, where jade deposits made the region strategically important to the Maya world for centuries, there stands a site called Quirigua, which in the 8th century of the Common Era was a relatively modest settlement under the political influence of the much larger and more powerful city of Copan, roughly 50 kilometers to the southeast. Copan was one of the great intellectual centers of the classic Maya world, a city famous for its sculptural program and its astronomical knowledge and its long-running royal dynasty, and its relationship with Quirigua had been, for as long as the inscriptions allow us to trace it, the relationship of a dominant patron with a subordinate client. Then, in the year 738, something changed. A ruler at Quirigua, whose name in the glyph record is rendered as Kako Dio Chanyopat, a name that translates approximately as fire-burning sky lightning god, managed to capture the ruling king of Copan and behead him, ending one of the longest royal dynasties in the Maya lowlands and fundamentally disrupting the political order of the entire southeastern region. The monument that Catastrophic commissioned to commemorate this event still stands at Quirigua, and it is one of the most remarkable objects in the entire corpus of classic Maya art. A monolithic sandstone stela nearly 8 meters tall, the tallest such monument anywhere in the Maya world, covered in relief carvings that record the capture and execution of the Copan king in the precise, formulaic language of Maya royal commemoration. The monument is also a statement of independence, a declaration that Quirigua was no longer a client city, but a sovereign polity with its own ruler capable of defeating and killing the lord of one of the most prestigious cities in the lowlands. In the political logic of classic Maya culture, where the capture and ritual execution of enemy rulers was one of the primary ways that royal authority was demonstrated and legitimized, this was not simply a military victory, but a cosmological claim, an assertion that the divine forces had shifted their favor from Copan to Quirigua, that the order of the world had been rearranged. What makes the 738 event significant for the larger story of the collapse is not the event itself, but what it represents. A moment at which the rules of engagement in the lowland political system changed in ways that made the system less stable and more destructive. Maya cities had always fought each other. Warfare was endemic to the classic period. A constant presence in the inscriptions and in the archaeological record of burned structures and trophy skulls and fortification walls. But the warfare of the earlier classic period had been conducted within a framework of conventions and hierarchies that limited its most destabilizing effects. The great patron cities, Tikal and Copan above all, managed the political relationships of their client networks in ways that channeled conflict without allowing it to become systemically destructive. What happens in the 8th century is a breakdown of that management, a period in which the constraints that had previously contained the violence begin to fail. Before examining why the system broke down, it's worth understanding more precisely how the system had worked when it was functioning. The classic Maya political order rested on a hierarchy of titles and relationships that was remarkably consistent across the entire lowland region, despite the absence of any central authority to enforce it. At the top of the hierarchy were the great overlords, rulers who bore the title of Kalumte, a designation of paramount authority that placed them above the ordinary level of Maya kingship, and whose political reach extended through networks of alliance and tributary obligation across hundreds of kilometers of forest. Below them were the Aho, the lords of independent polities, each with their own divine sanction and their own dynastic claims, but operating within a framework of relationships with more powerful cities that provided both protection and constraint. Below them were the Sahal, the subordinate lords of dependent communities, whose obligations ran upward through the hierarchy in the form of labor and tribute and military service. The system was not egalitarian, and it was not gentle, but it was organized, and its organization had sustained a remarkably complex political landscape for centuries by providing mechanisms for resolving conflicts without allowing them to become systemically destructive. The reasons for this breakdown are debated among scholars, and the most likely explanation seems to involve a combination of factors rather than any single cause. The population of the southern lowlands had been growing for centuries, and by the 8th century was pressing against the productive limits of the agricultural systems that sustained it. More people meant more competition for the land and water and resources that cities needed to survive, and more competition meant more reasons for conflict. At the same time, political prestige economy that had organized the Maya lowlands, in which cities competed through monument building and alliance forming and ritual display as much as through direct military confrontation, was becoming more expensive to maintain relative to the resources available to sustain it. The monuments of the 8th century are, in general, larger and more elaborate than those of previous centuries, which is consistent with the political culture under intensifying competitive pressure, spending more on the signals of status precisely because the underlying position was becoming less secure. The monument itself became a model. Other cities, watching what Quirigua had achieved, understood that the rules they had previously operated under were no longer reliably enforced. If a client city could capture and execute the king of its patron, if such an act could be commemorated in stone rather than triggering a punitive response that erased the offending city from the map, then the constraints on what was politically possible had loosened in ways that made every political relationship in the lowlands slightly less predictable. Trust, in a political system built on alliance networks maintained through the expectation of mutual benefit and mutual restraint, is not a sentimental concern. It is a structural requirement, and when it begins to erode, the costs of maintaining the alliances that keep the system working increase, while the reliability of the system's protections decreases, which creates exactly the incentive structure that produces more conflict, which erodes trust further, which increases the costs of maintaining alliances further still. The defeat of Copan by Quirigua rippled outward through the southeastern Maya world in ways that the inscriptions allow us to partially trace. The Copan dynasty did not end with the beheading of its king in 738, but its regional influence was severely diminished, and the elaborate network of alliances and tributary relationships that had organized the southeastern lowlands around Copan's authority was disrupted in ways that took generations to partially reconstruct. Cities that had oriented their politics around their relationship with Copan now had to navigate a more uncertain landscape, with a weakened patron and an emboldened rival in Quirigua, and the political calculations of every minor lord in the region shifted accordingly. This kind of cascading disruption was not unique to the southeastern lowlands. Across the classic Maya world in the 8th century, the inscriptions record an intensification of the language of warfare, more frequent accounts of battles and captures and destructions, more monuments commemorating military victories, more evidence in the archaeological record for burning and abandonment of specific sites. The political alliances that had structured the lowland system were being tested and broken with increasing frequency, and the ability of the major patron cities to reimpose order after such disruptions was declining. Across the classic Maya world in the 8th century, the inscriptions record an intensification of the language of warfare, more frequent accounts of battles and captures and destructions, more monuments commemorating military victories, more evidence in the archaeological record for burning and abandonment of specific sites. The political alliances that had structured the lowland system were being tested and broken with increasing frequency, and the ability of the major patron cities to reimpose order after such disruptions was declining. The inscriptions from the great classic cities record these conflicts in the formal language of royal triumph, listing the names of captives taken and the dates of victories and the subsequent ceremonies in which captured rulers were humiliated and killed before assembled populations. Reading them now, with the knowledge of what came afterward, there is something almost vertiginous about the confidence they project. The assumption embedded in every monument that the system producing these victories was permanent. That the king commissioning this record of his triumph was establishing a legacy that his successors would continue to build on. That the city whose glory he was rating in stone would still be here, still producing monuments, still populated by people who would read and venerate these records of his deeds. the monuments were wrong, not because the kings who commissioned them were foolish, but because the forces gathering against the system they celebrated were not yet visible in any single year's accumulation of events, only in the long view that hindsight provides. The city of Dos Pilas, in the Pitexbatun region of what is now Guatemala, offers a particularly vivid illustration of what this intensification of conflict could do to a specific place over the course of a few generations. Dos Pilas had been established in the 7th century as a client outpost of Tikal, a way of projecting Tikal's influence into a region that Tikal's great rival Calakmul was also contesting. Over the course of the 7th and 8th centuries, Dos Pilas switched allegiances, fought a series of wars against its own parent city, was captured and recaptured, and eventually became the center of a regional military power in its own right before being abandoned in a period of intense conflict in the late 8th century. The inscriptions at Dos Pilas record a political history of extraordinary volatility, a city whose existence was defined by war and whose end came when the warfare it had helped to generate finally consumed it. The physical evidence for what increased warfare meant in practice is visible in the archaeology of the period in ways that go beyond the royal inscriptions. Fortification walls appear at Maya sites in the late Classic period that were not present in earlier phases. Earthworks and palisades and defensive ditches that represent significant investments of labor and that speak to a political environment in which attack was a genuine and anticipated threat rather than an occasional occurrence. At some sites, the construction of defensive works cut through agricultural land that had previously been cultivated, a choice that makes sense only in a context where the risk of violence was judged to be more immediate than the cost of reduced food production. The reorganization of settlement patterns around defensible locations, with communities moving from exposed lowland areas to positions on high ground or within existing fortification systems, shows up in survey data across the southern lowlands in the 8th and 9th centuries, a landscape quietly reorganizing itself around the requirements of survival rather than the requirements of agricultural efficiency. The warfare reached into the lives of ordinary people in ways that the inscriptions, which are primarily concerned with royal affairs, do not directly describe, but that the archaeological record increasingly illuminates. Survey work at major Maya sites has found evidence of large numbers of people crowding into the central precincts of cities during periods of conflict, seeking the protection of the ceremonial core, and the nutritional stress that shows up in skeletal remains from the late Classic period suggests populations under pressure in ways consistent with agricultural disruption caused by warfare. Fields that had been cultivated for generations were being abandoned or left fallow during periods of conflict, and the accumulated ecological knowledge that made Maya agriculture work in this difficult landscape, the specific understanding of which fields drained well and which didn't, which soils needed, what kinds of management, how the irrigation systems had to be maintained, was eroding along with the social and institutional structures that had stored and transmitted it. It is worth pausing here, because what we're describing is not a dramatic collapse, but an accumulation, a slow thickening of difficulty that is almost impossible to see from inside while it is happening. The ecological consequences of prolonged warfare compounded the agricultural stress in ways that deserve attention, because they help explain why the damage was so difficult to reverse. Maya agriculture depended on a complex management of the landscape that required not just labor, but knowledge, accumulated understanding of how specific soils behaved, how drainage channels had to be maintained to remain functional, which areas of the forest could be cleared and which needed to be left as buffer zones to prevent erosion on the slopes that fed the catchment systems below. This knowledge was not written down in any form that survives. It was held by farmers and local water managers and agricultural specialists who had learned it from the generations before them, and who passed it on to the generations that followed as part of the ordinary transmission of practical expertise that keeps a working agricultural system working. Warfare disrupted this transmission in ways that are almost impossible to quantify, and the landscape became less productive, not only because the fields were disrupted, but because the knowledge that made the fields productive was disrupted alongside them. A farmer in the Peton in 780 would not have experienced the collapse of the classic Maya as an event. He would have experienced a series of bad seasons, an increase in the demands his local lord placed on his labor and his surplus, a sense that the roads were less safe than they had been, that the markets were less reliable, that the promises of the political system were harder to cash. He would have seen neighboring communities shrink or disappear. He would have watched the forest return to fields that had been in cultivation for his entire lifetime. And at some point, without drama, without ceremony, he would have decided to leave, to take his family to wherever the prospects seemed better, which might have been a city in the northern lowlands or a smaller community away from the main centers of political competition. And the house he left behind would have begun, immediately, to be reclaimed by the vegetation that the forest had never entirely given up. The warfare that spread through the southern lowlands in the 8th century was not simply violence adding to violence. Though the violence was real and the loss of life was real, it was a system feeding on itself, each conflict depleting the agricultural surpluses and population reserves and political trust that the cities needed to sustain themselves, each disrupted alliance creating new instabilities, each sacked city reducing the trade network that every other city depended on. The lowland Maya world had been built on interdependence, and what the wars of the 8th century did, slowly and without any single decisive battle, was begin to dismantle the networks that made interdependence possible. And that is where we leave the wars, the fracturing alliances and the burning fields and the fortification walls being built across cultivated land. The entire lowland political system grinding itself down in ways that no single city's victory could reverse. We can step back now from the monuments and the inscriptions and look at something the inscriptions cannot tell us: the environmental conditions inside which all of this was happening. The specific character of the landscape during the decades when the cities were failing. The story of the Maya collapse cannot be told through politics alone, because the politics were happening inside a climate that was shifting in ways the kings could not commission monuments to address, and the calendar priests could not compute their way around. In what is now the northern Yucatan Peninsula, in a shallow lake called Chichen Canab, there is a record of rainfall going back several thousand years that the lake itself preserved without knowing it was preserving anything. Sediment settles at the bottom of lakes in layers, one year's accumulation on top of the previous years. And in that accumulation, the chemical signatures of the water conditions that produced it are preserved with a precision that no other kind of archive can match. When rainfall is high, the water flowing into the lake brings particular ratios of oxygen isotopes, heavy and light, that reflect the atmospheric conditions of abundant precipitation. When rainfall is low and evaporation is high, the ratio shifts, the heavier isotopes concentrate, and the shift is recorded in the carbonate minerals forming in the lake sediment at the time. Read the layers in sequence, and you have a record of wet years and dry years extending back as far as the sediment goes. Drill a core from the bottom of Chichen Canab, and you are reading a climate archive that was being written at the same time the classic Maya were building their cities overhead. When researchers first analyzed cores from Chichen Canab in the early 1990s, What they found in the layers corresponding to the 8th and 9th centuries of the Common Era was a signal of reduced rainfall and increased evaporation, the isotopic signature of drought conditions that extended across multiple decades and that, in terms of their severity, had few parallels in the preceding 1,000 years of the record. The finding was significant when it appeared, but it was also somewhat isolated. A single lake in the northern Yucatan that might or might not be representative of conditions across the broader lowland region. What happened over the following 3 decades was a progressive accumulation of corroborating evidence from other sites, other proxies, other analytical methods that built the initial finding into something considerably more robust. Titanium concentrations in marine sediments off the coast of Venezuela, far from the Maya lowlands, provided an independent measure of rainfall in the broader Caribbean region. Because titanium is carried into coastal waters by river runoff, and its concentration in offshore sediments reflects how much rainfall is flushing material from the land. The titanium record from these cores, analyzed in the early 2000s, showed a pattern of reduced rainfall during the 8th through 10th centuries that was consistent with the Chichen Janub isotope data and extended the evidence for drought conditions across a much wider geographic area. Tree ring records from regions adjacent to the Maya lowlands, where ancient wood preserves a year-by-year account of growing conditions, added another line of evidence pointing in the same direction. Speleothem records, the mineral deposits that form in caves from dripping groundwater, provided yet another independent signal. No single proxy was definitive on its own. The convergence of multiple independent lines of evidence pointing to the same conclusion is what makes the case for drought as a significant factor in the collapse as strong as it now is. What makes the climate evidence particularly compelling is not any single proxy, but the convergence of multiple independent data sets pointing to the same conclusion, a convergence that has grown more persuasive as new research has added more lines of evidence. In the years following the initial Chichen Janub analysis, the debate in the scholarly literature was energetic and appropriately skeptical. A single lake core from the northern Yucatan was not enough to establish drought as a significant factor in a collapse that covered the entire southern lowland region, and critics of the drought hypothesis pointed out that the Chichen Janub site was geographically distant from most of the major collapsed cities and might not accurately reflect conditions further south. What changed over the following 2 decades was the accumulation of evidence from sites that addressed those geographic objections, from locations within or adjacent to the core collapse zone rather than at its northern periphery, that supported the same general conclusion. The late 8th and 9th centuries were drier than the preceding period and drier in ways that would have placed significant stress on the agricultural and water management systems of the southern lowland cities. The scholarly debate has shifted accordingly. The question is no longer whether drought was a factor, but how significant a factor it was relative to the political and social pressures that the previous section described, and how drought and political stress interacted to produce an outcome that neither alone might have caused. The current consensus, to the extent that a field of active research produces anything so settled as consensus, is that drought was a significant contributing factor that amplified existing political and agricultural stresses rather than a simple external cause that overwhelmed an otherwise healthy civilization. This distinction matters because it changes what we think the collapse was about. It was not a civilization defeated by its environment. It was a civilization that had been managing its environment successfully for centuries, and that encountered in the late 8th and 9th centuries a combination of stresses that exceeded the capacity of its management systems to absorb. The geography of water in the Maya lowlands made the civilization particularly vulnerable to the kind of drought the proxies were describing. Rainfall in this region is highly seasonal, concentrated in a wet season that runs roughly from May through October, and followed by a dry season in which essentially no rain falls. The entire agricultural and water management system that sustained the classic cities was built around capturing and storing wet season rainfall for use through the dry season, and that system functioned adequately in years when the wet season brought its expected precipitation. In drought years, when the wet season rains were reduced or delayed, the reservoirs that cities depended on filled less completely, the fields produced less, and the margin between adequate and inadequate was narrower than in normal years. A single drought year could be managed, several consecutive drought years, or a pattern of below-average rainfall sustained over a decade or two would have depleted the stored water and the agricultural surplus that cities needed not just for daily subsistence, but for the political economy of tribute and redistribution that kept the whole system running. These episodes would not have felt to the people living through them like a climate event in the sense we might recognize today. They would have felt like bad years, years when the rains came late, when the harvest was thin, when the reservoirs did not fill. In a good year, these problems could be absorbed. In a sequence of such years, compounding with the demands of a political system under military stress, they could not. There is a dimension of the environmental story that the climate data alone does not capture, which is the state of the soils themselves after centuries of intensive cultivation. The thin, acidic soils of the Maya lowlands are not naturally suited to sustained agriculture. They require careful management to maintain their productivity over time, including the incorporation of organic matter to rebuild nutrient levels depleted by successive harvests, the use of raised field systems and terracing on slopes to prevent erosion and waterlogging, and the rotation of cultivated areas with periods of forest fallow that allow the soil microbiology to recover. The Maya agricultural system at its height was sophisticated enough to sustain very large populations by managing these requirements carefully, but the evidence suggests that by the late Classic period, the agricultural intensification needed to feed growing populations was pushing against the limits of what the soil management practices could maintain. Pollen records from lake sediments in the southern lowlands show a steady increase in the proportion of agricultural indicators relative to forest indicators across the Classic period, consistent with progressive deforestation and agricultural expansion. At many sites, this increase accelerates in the 8th century, which is consistent with what we'd expect from a population under pressure trying to increase food production at the same moment that the political system was making increasing demands on agricultural surplus in the form of tribute and labor. The combination of intensified cultivation and reduced fallow periods would have depleted soil nutrients faster than they could be replenished, reducing yields in ways that made every additional drought year more damaging than it would have been on healthier soils. The land was tired, and the rains were becoming unreliable, and these two facts compounded each other in ways that the agricultural knowledge of the Classic period, however sophisticated, was not designed to address simultaneously. The question of how people living through the collapse experienced the environmental deterioration is one that the archaeological record can only partially answer, but it is worth trying to reconstruct, because the human experience of the collapse was not the same as the statistical summary of the climate data. A drought severe enough to show up as a distinct signal in lake sediment isotope ratios is a drought that lasted years, possibly decades, and was severe enough to affect the water chemistry of an entire lake. Living inside that drought, you would not have had access to the lake sediment data. What you would have had was the direct experience of your fields producing less than they should, of the dry season arriving before the reservoirs were full, of the corn crop failing in a year when it had no business failing, of the prayers and the ceremonies and the offerings not producing the rains that they were supposed to produce because they had always produced them before. The religious and political system of classic Maya civilization rested on a covenant between the ruling class and the supernatural order. The kings performed the sacrifices and the ceremonies that maintained cosmic balance, and in exchange, the rains came and the maize grew and the cities continued. When the rain stopped coming as expected, the covenant appeared to have failed, and in a political culture where the authority of kings was grounded in their ability to mediate between the human world and the divine, that failure had political consequences that compounded the agricultural ones. The relationship between drought and Maya agriculture was mediated by a layer of human agency and accumulated ecological management that is worth attending to carefully, because it complicates any simple reading of drought as an external force, simply overwhelming a helpless population. The classic Maya had not built their civilization on the assumption of unlimited water. They had built it on the assumption of managed water, and the management systems they developed over centuries were sophisticated enough to buffer against significant rainfall variability. The reservoirs at Tikal, for example, were not small catch basins, but engineered hydraulic systems covering several square kilometers, capable of storing millions of liters of water, maintained by specialists whose understanding of how the system worked had been refined over generations. In normal conditions, these systems provided the city with water security that simple reliance on wells or seasonal streams could never have achieved. But their effectiveness was also their vulnerability. They were maintained, calibrated to the specific conditions of the landscape in which they operated, and their performance under conditions outside their design parameters was limited. A drought severe enough to reduce wet season rainfall below the threshold at which the reservoirs filled adequately would have stressed the system in ways that the management knowledge, however sophisticated, could not fully compensate for. The deforestation that accompanied the growth of classic Maya cities made this vulnerability worse in ways that are now reasonably well understood. The Maya lowland forest is not simply passive vegetation. It is an active participant in the regional hydrological cycle, capturing moisture from the air, releasing it through evapotranspiration, and influencing local rainfall patterns in ways that forest models suggest were significant. When large areas of forest are cleared for agriculture or for the production of lime plaster, which Maya architects use in enormous quantities and which required burning large amounts of wood to produce, the hydrological contribution of the forest is reduced or eliminated in those areas. This does not cause regional drought on its own, but it reduces the land's capacity to retain and recycle water, makes the agricultural fields more dependent on direct rainfall with less buffer from the moisture that the forest was previously cycling through the system, and contributes to a landscape that is more vulnerable to rainfall variability than the forested landscape that preceded it. The Maya cities, by growing large and ambitious and architecturally elaborate, had made themselves more susceptible to precisely the kind of climate variability that the 9th century appears to have brought. The timing of all this matters, and it is worth being precise about it, because the convergence of the political and environmental pressures in the same decades is not coincidental. The political fragmentation that the wars of the 8th century produced made the environmental management harder precisely when the environment was becoming more difficult to manage. Reservoirs that required coordinated maintenance across multiple communities became harder to maintain when those communities were in conflict with each other or had fled the region. Agricultural systems that depended on regional specialization and trade, with different areas producing different crops and exchanging surpluses through the market and tribute networks, became less efficient when the trade routes were disrupted and the political authority that enforced tribute collection had weakened. The skills and labor needed to build new water catchment systems or rehabilitate failing ones were being drawn off by warfare and by the political demands of a royal system that was spending its remaining resources on monuments and ceremonies rather than agricultural infrastructure. Each set of problems made the other set of problems worse, and the combined weight of both was more than the system could bear. The combination of drought and deforestation and soil degradation created a feedback loop that was genuinely difficult to reverse. Less forests meant less moisture retention, which meant drier conditions during the dry season, which stressed the agricultural systems that the population depended on, which created pressure to clear more forest, to expand agricultural area to compensate for declining yields, which reduced forest cover further, which worsened the moisture retention, which made the drought episodes more damaging. It was not a deliberate process, and it was not the result of ignorance. The people managing these landscapes were skilled and experienced and were doing the best they could with the knowledge available to them. The system they had built was sophisticated and had worked well for centuries. What it could not do was adapt quickly enough to the convergence of stresses that the late 8th and 9th centuries brought, and by the time the adaptations that might have helped were clearly necessary, the institutional capacity to implement them was itself being eroded by the political fragmentation that the wars and the agricultural failures had produced. What the sediment cores and the tree ring records and the titanium concentration studies have assembled across 3 decades of paleoclimatological research is a picture of environmental conditions in the southern lowlands during the 8th and 9th centuries that the people living through them would have experienced as a slow and bewildering deterioration, harvests failing in years that should have been adequate, water sources that had always been reliable becoming unreliable, the forests that had been cleared for agriculture no longer returning as forest but as something thinner and less useful, the landscape becoming less hospitable in ways that no ritual, however correctly performed, seemed able to reverse. And that is where we leave the environmental story. The drought and the depleted soils and the feedback loops that made each problem worse than it would have been without the others. The whole system becoming less hospitable in ways that no ceremony could address and no political arrangement could compensate for. We can move forward now into the last decades of the 8th century and the long stretch of the 9th, into the period when the consequences of everything that had been accumulating finally became visible in the most direct and undeniable way available to us, the stopping of the monuments. What happened next was not a dramatic fall, but a departure. A slow draining of the cities that left the stone structures standing, while taking away everything that had made them mean something. In the year 822, a king at Copan commissioned a monument. This is not, on its face, a remarkable statement. Maya kings had been commissioning monuments at Copan for roughly 4 centuries by that point, erecting carved stone stelae on significant calendar dates to record the reign of the current king, his connections to his ancestors, his military victories and ritual accomplishments, the endorsement of the gods for his continued authority. The monument erected in 822, which scholars catalogue as Stela 11, is not significantly different from the monuments that preceded it in terms of its content or its craftsmanship. What makes it remarkable is what it was followed by, which is nothing. No further dated monuments were erected at Copan after 822. The century-and-a-half of stone carving tradition that had produced one of the richest monumental records in the Maya world simply stopped, in the way that a clock stops, not gradually, with the hands slowing, but at a specific moment, after which there is only the face of the clock with the hands in the position they were when the mechanism failed. The ending of the monument record at Copan was not unique. City by city, across the southern lowlands in the late 8th and 9th centuries, the inscriptions stop. Quirigua, whose last monument dates to 810. Palenque, last dated monument in 799. Tikal, where the last dated inscription appears in 869, late enough that the city had already been declining for several generations. Piedras Negras, Yaxchilan, Dos Pilas, city after city, the stone record simply ends. Each city's last inscription marking a terminus beyond which we have no royal biography, no account of accession or victory or ritual. The dates span roughly a century from the last decades of the 8th century to the early 10th, and their distribution across the lowlands is not random. The cities of the southern lowlands, the ones deepest in the territory, most affected by the combination of warfare and drought and soil degradation, tend to have earlier terminal dates. Cities in less stressed locations persisted longer, but the direction of movement was consistent. The monument record was retreating, city by city, from the south and west toward the north and east, like a tide going out. The stones were the last to go. Everything else went first. The question of what it means for a city to be abandoned is worth sitting with, because the word carries connotations of abruptness that do not match what the archaeological record actually shows. At most classic Maya sites, the process that resulted in abandonment was not a sudden exodus, but a prolonged diminishment. Population levels declined over decades, not overnight. The large civic and ceremonial precincts that had been maintained by community labor fell into disrepair as the labor force that maintained them shrank and the political authority that organized that labor weakened. The residential areas around a ceremonial core contracted inward, with the outlying neighborhoods being left first and the population concentrating in the central areas where access to water and political protection was greatest. Then those central areas began to thin as well, as families made the calculations that individual families make when the resources necessary to sustain a particular way of life become unavailable, and decided to leave. The forest was already at work while people were still deciding whether to leave. Seeds germinated in the cracks of unmaintained plazas, roots found purchase in the joints between stones. The jungle did not wait for permission. The archaeology of abandonment at specific sites tells us things about the process that the inscriptions, which had stopped by this point, cannot. At Aguata, a site in the Petexbatun region of Guatemala that was attacked and burned around 800 CEN, excavations found something remarkable. A city abandoned in such haste that objects inside houses and workshops were left exactly where they had been when the inhabitants fled. Lithic tools in mid-production, ceramic vessels still on their supports, the contents of rooms preserved in place by the collar, laps of the roofs that covered them. The site gave archaeologists a glimpse of a moment of abandonment rather than its long aftermath. And what it showed was not the orderly departure of a community that had decided collectively to move on, but the sudden flight of a population under immediate threat. Aguaca was not a city that gradually emptied. It was attacked, partially burned, and never reoccupied. Not all the southern lowland cities ended this dramatically. The majority appear to have emptied more slowly, over years and decades rather than in a single traumatic event. And the archaeology of their abandonment looks correspondingly different, with the gradual accumulation of debris and the progressive disrepair of structures that were no longer being maintained. But Aguaita reminds us that the long-duration view of the collapse, in which it appears as a slow statistical process distributed across a century, was composed of individual experiences that were sometimes sudden and devastating. What people left for is a question that the archaeological record answers partly but not completely. The clearest signal of where population went during the southern lowland collapse is the population growth that occurred in the northern Yucatan during roughly the same period. As cities like Chichen Itza and Oxmal and the other major northern centers reached the peaks of their classic and terminal classic periods at precisely the moment the southern cities were failing. Some proportion of the people who left the southern lowlands went north, bringing the cultural and technical knowledge of the classic tradition with them and contributing to the florescence of what is now usually called the terminal classic in the north. Other populations appear to have dispersed into smaller communities throughout the lowlands, living in ways that left less archaeological trace than the major cities, but that maintained continuity with the classic way of life at a smaller scale. The archaeological evidence for what life was actually like in the cities during the decline is vivid in ways that the inscriptions, which had stopped by this point, cannot provide. At Copan, excavations of residential areas have found evidence of communities continuing to occupy the site for generations after the last monument was erected, living among the ruins of a formerly large city, maintaining a modified version of the classic Maya way of life without the royal court that had organized it. The evidence of diet and health in these post-abandonment populations is mixed. Some indicators suggest stress and nutritional deficiency, consistent with a population living in a degraded agricultural environment, while others show continuity of subsistence practices and what appears to be a reasonably functional, if reduced, community life. The city did not become uninhabitable overnight. It became a different kind of place, a place where a smaller number of people lived among very large buildings that they had not built and that they were not building anymore. The experience of living in a city after the institution that made it a city has failed is something that we might recognize from later and more familiar historical contexts. The long aftermath of Rome's decline in the cities of Western Europe, where population shrank dramatically but did not vanish, and where the physical infrastructure of the Roman city was adapted for uses its builders had not intended. The forum becoming a market, the temple becoming a church, the amphitheater becoming a defensive enclosure for a much smaller population than the one for which it was designed. The Maya cities of the southern lowlands went through something recognizably similar, though without the external power that eventually replaced Roman political organization in Western Europe. What replaced the classic Maya royal courts in the southern lowlands was not a new political structure, but the absence of any large-scale political structure at all. Smaller communities and local authority without the overarching system of dynasty and cosmological legitimacy that had organized classic Maya life for centuries. The persistence of population at some southern lowland sites long after the monument record ended has implications for how we understand what the collapse actually destroyed. What ended was not the Maya people, but a specific form of political and cultural organization. The classic Maya royal court system, with its elaborate ceremonies and its monumental art and its complex astronomical and calendrical practice. The people who remained in and around the former cities continued to live, to farm, to maintain elements of Maya cultural practice at a community level, even as the institutional superstructure dissolved around them. The collapse was a collapse of elite culture and political organization rather than of human habitation as such, devastating in the ways that the loss of complex political organization is always devastating, but not an extinction. It is worth pausing here to sit with the particular quality of this kind of ending, because it is so different from the dramatic collapses that dominate our imagination of how civilizations end. There was no burning, or not much burning. There was no conquering army arriving from outside to take possession of the cities and reorder them under new management. There was no single terrible year in which everything that had been functional became dysfunctional at once. What there was, in city after city, across the southern lowlands over the course of roughly a century, was a gradual diminishment. Fewer people, less food, less political authority, fewer resources for the maintenance of the ceremonial infrastructure that had defined what these places were, until eventually, the number of people still living there was not sufficient to sustain the system that had marred the city a city in the first place, and then they left, and the forest came back. The inscriptions themselves have something to say about this moment of ending. Or rather, they have something to say by their absence. The late classic period in the southern lowlands produced a genre of monuments that scholars sometimes call the historical retrospective, stelae and panels commissioned by later kings to record the deeds of their predecessors. The long dynastic genealogies that established the legitimacy of the current ruler by connecting him to a line of ancestors stretching back to the founding of the dynasty. These retrospective monuments are abundant in the 7th century and into the 8th, a sign of dynasties feeling secure enough in their position to invest heavily in the historical framing of their authority. In the late 8th and 9th centuries, they become rarer and then disappear, and the monuments that were still being produced in the final phases of the classic period tend to be shorter, less elaborate, and more focused on immediate political claims than on the long historical depth that earlier monuments had been at pains to establish. The dynasties of the terminal classic were not spending their remaining resources on history. They were spending them on the present, which was becoming urgent in ways that made deep historical retrospection seem like a luxury they could not afford. The quality of the stonework on late classic monuments is also, at some sites, noticeably different from earlier periods, in ways that are consistent with a disruption of the specialist traditions that had produced the finest classic carving. The most accomplished classic Maya stone carving required sustained training across years, a teacher-student relationship that produced craftsmen capable of executing the complex interlocking figures and the precise glyph sequences that the best monuments demanded. And that relationship required the institutional stability of a royal court with the resources and the continuity to maintain speciale, straining programs over generations. When that institutional stability began to erode, the quality of what the diminished courts could commission declined accordingly, not because the individual carvers were less talented, but because the system that had trained and sustained them was failing. The speed at which the forest reclaims abandoned structures in the Maya lowlands is remarkable and, if you have not seen it, difficult to adequately imagine. Within a generation of a building being left unmaintained, trees establish themselves in the fill between the stones, roots expanding as the trees grow and exerting forces on the masonry that no building was designed to resist. Within a century, a substantial structure can be covered in several meters of tree growth. The shape of the original building legible to a trained eye in the irregular mounds it produces in the forest floor, but otherwise invisible. Within several centuries, the building is archaeology, something that only systematic excavation reveals, that looks from the outside like a natural hill or ridge, that gives no immediate indication of its origin until the first layer of soil is removed and the first dressed stone face appears. The forest was doing this throughout the 9th and 10th centuries in the abandoned cities of the southern lowlands. The plazas that had been kept clear by the constant work of maintenance and occupation filled first with weeds and then with shrubs and then with young trees. The roads, the saps that had connected the cities, were reclaimed in the same way, their raised limestone causeways becoming indistinguishable from natural ridges as the vegetation covered them. The buildings held their forms longer, but even they were not exempt. the roots finding their way into every crack and joint and expanding season by season until the stones shifted and the faces began to sprawl and the geometry of the building became something the forest was in the process of dissolving rather than something it contained. There is something worth noting about the way the classic Maya collapse is sometimes narrated in popular accounts, which tend to emphasize the mystery of the abandonment, the strange fact of sophisticated cities being simply left, as though the abandonment itself were the most puzzling thing about the collapse. The archaeology and the historical analysis have made the abandonment considerably less mysterious than it once seemed. We understand why people left. They left because the systems that had made these cities worth living in were failing. The agriculture was less reliable. The political structures were less capable of providing security and organizing collective resources. The accumulated stresses of war and drought and soil degradation had made the calculation of staying increasingly unfavorable relative to the calculation of going. What remains genuinely difficult to understand is not why people left, but what it felt like to be the last ones. The small communities still occupying the edges of the former cities while the great ceremonial centers stood empty. The plaza trees already taller than a person, the roads already becoming forest. The cities did not end the way cities end in the stories we tell about historical catastrophe. There was no burning, or not much burning. There was no single moment of defeat. What there was, in city after city across the southern lowlands over the course of roughly a century, was a gradual diminishment. Fewer people, less food, less political authority, fewer resources for the maintenance of the ceremonial infrastructure that had defined what these places were, until eventually the number of people still living there was not sufficient to sustain the system that had made the city a city in the first place. And then they left, and the forest came back. And that is where we leave the silence of the southern lowlands, the great cities emptied over decades, the forest advancing behind the people who had walked away, the plazas sinking under decades of leaf fall and root pressure and rain. We can move forward now, away from the particular quality of loss that the southern collapse represents, towards something that the story of the Maya collapse is very often told without: what came next, what survived, and what the silence of the southern cities looked like from the perspective of a civilization that was still very much alive elsewhere. The end of Tikal and Copan and Palenque as functioning political centers was not the end of the Maya. It was, in the longer view, a reorientation. In the northern Yucatan Peninsula, on a flat limestone plain that receives even less rainfall than the southern lowlands and that has no surface water at all except the sinkholes called cenotes, where the limestone has collapsed to expose the underground water table below. A city was rising in the 9th and 10th centuries, at almost exactly the moment the great cities of the south were falling silent. Empty. Chichen Itza, which translates roughly as the mouth of the well of the Itza people, was not a new city in the 9th century. It had earlier phases of occupation going back several centuries, but what it became in the terminal classic and early post-classic periods, from roughly the 9th century onward, was something genuinely new in the Maya world, a political and religious center of a different kind than the classic lowland cities, organized around different principles and drawing on a wider range of influences than the southern cities had typically incorporated. The scale of what was built at Chichen Itza in the terminal classic and early post-classic periods is worth taking in before examining its specific character. The El Castillo Pyramid, the dominant structure at the center of the site, was aligned with astronomical precision so that on the spring and autumn equinoxes, the angle of the afternoon sun creates a shadow pattern on its northern staircase that gives the appearance of a serpent descending from the temple at the top. a deliberate visual effect that required both sophisticated astronomical knowledge and remarkable architectural control to achieve. The Great Ball Court at Chichen Itza is the largest in Mesoamerica, nearly twice as long as a football field, with acoustical properties that allowed a whisper at one end to be heard clearly at the other, and it was decorated with carved relief panels depicting ritual scenes of gameplay and sacrifice that communicate, even now, the serious religious weight that the ball game carried in Mesoameric and culture. The observatory building at the site, known as El Caracol from the spiral staircase inside it, has windows aligned to the setting positions of Venus at significant points in its cycle, confirming a continuity of astronomical concern with the classic period cities to the south. These buildings are not lesser achievements than those of the classic south. They are different achievements, products of a different political moment and a different cultural synthesis. The architecture of Chichen Itza is one of the most immediately striking things about it, because it does not look entirely like the other great Maya sites. The buildings share the fundamental Maya architectural vocabulary, the corbelled arches, the carved inscriptions, the astronomical orientations, but they blend it with forms and motifs that appear to come from central Mexico, from the Toltec tradition associated with the city of Tula in what is now the state of Hidalgo, in ways that scholars have been debating for well over a century. The great platform of the feathered serpent deity, whose form appears prominently at Chichen Itza in ways that have no clear precedent in the classic Maya South, connects the site to a broader Mesoamerican world of religious exchange and political influence that the classic cities, despite their own long-distance connections, had not incorporated so visibly into their monumental architecture. What this means for the specific history of who built Chichen Itza and through what process of cultural exchange has been argued without resolution since the 19th century, and the debate continues in more technically sophisticated forms today. What is less contested is what Chichen Itza represents in the broader story of Maya civilization after the southern collapse. The northern lowlands had always been part of the Maya world, connected to the south by trade and by cultural ties and by the shared religious and calendrical traditions that made the Maya lowlands a single cultural zone despite their political fragmentation. The people who built Chichen Itza were Maya, speaking Maya languages, worshipping Maya deities in forms that were recognizably continuous with the classic tradition. And the city they built drew on the accumulated architectural and astronomical and artistic knowledge of the classic period, even as it transformed it. The collapse of the South did not reset Maya civilization to zero. It redistributed it, shifted the center of gravity northward, and in doing so produced a political culture that was in some respects more cosmopolitan and more externally connected than the inward-looking city-state politics of the classic lowlands had been. The contrast between the fate of the southern cities and the somewhat longer survival of the northern ones is instructive precisely because the northern cities were not immune to the pressures that had undone the south. They faced their own political conflicts, their own pericultural challenges, their own periods of drought and stress. What they seem to have had, in addition to the structural advantages of underground water access and more flexible political organization, was the benefit of not being at the center of the system that had collapsed. The classic Maya political economy had been organized around the great patron cities of the south, Tikal and Copan, and the collapse of that organizational structure, while catastrophic for the south, also freed the periphery from the tribute and alliance obligations that had channeled resources toward the center. Cities in the north that had previously sent tribute to southern patrons and organized their politics partly around the demands of those relationships found themselves, in the aftermath of the southern collapse, in a more autonomous position, able to use their resources for local purposes rather than directing them upward through the hierarchy. The collapse of the center created, at least temporarily, new possibilities at the edges. The northern cities survived longer than the southern ones, and they survived in part because the environmental conditions in the northern Yucatan were in some ways more buffered against the specific pressures that had undone the south. The sinkholes that provided water in the north were not dependent on seasonal rainfall collection in the same way the southern reservoirs were, drawing instead on underground water sources that were more stable across years of low surface rainfall. The political structures of the northern cities were different too, more oligarchic and less dependent on the authority of a single royal dynasty, which may have made them more resilient when political stress came. Because the failure or departure of one ruling family did not necessarily threaten the institutional continuity of the city in the way it did in the classic South. Chichen Itza was not the only northern city that rose to prominence during and after the southern collapse. Uxmal, in the Puc Hills region of what is now the state of Yucatan in Mexico, reached its architectural peak in the 9th and 10th centuries, producing buildings whose mosaic stone facades, covered in intricate geometric patterns, and the masks of the long-snouted rain deity Chuck, represent some of the most technically demanding stone carving in the pre-Columbian Americas. The Puc region cities, which included not just Uxmal but Caba and Sayil and Ladna and several others, formed a regional cluster of urban centers that flourished during the Terminal Classic in a way that suggests they absorbed some of the population and some of the skilled labor that the collapsing southern cities had released. The routes between these cities and the southern lowlands were open, and the movement of people, knowledge and artistic traditions along those routes in the 9th century was probably significant, though it is difficult to trace precisely in the archaeological record. What we can say is that the architectural and astronomical traditions of the classic South did not disappear with the southern cities. They traveled. Chichen Itza itself eventually declined, probably in the 11th or 12th century, its dominance challenged and eventually broken by competing cities. The northern Maya world reorganized itself into a period of smaller competing polities before the arrival of Spanish forces in the 16th century. The city of Mayapan, which dominated the northern lowlands for a time after Chichen Itza's decline, was itself abandoned following internal conflict in the 15th century, roughly a century before Spanish contact. The story of what European contact meant for the Maya is not the story this episode is telling, but it belongs in the frame, because one of the most important things about the Maya collapse of the 9th century is how it looks in comparison with what happened 5 or 6 centuries later. The Spanish conquest of the Yucatan was a sustained military campaign that took decades and encountered fierce and sustained resistance, and the colonial period that followed involved the destruction of most of the Maya written record, the systematic suppression of Maya religious and cultural practices, epidemic disease that reduced the Maya population by proportions that are still difficult to fully calculate, and a deliberate assault on Maya identity and self-understanding that was more thorough and more ideologically committed than anything the 9th century collapse had produced. If you were to ask which event was more damaging to Maya civilization, the abandonment of the classic cities in the 9th century or the Spanish conquest and colonial period beginning in the 16th, the answer would not be the 9th century. The Maya people survived both. They survived the collapse and the reorganization and the northern fluorescence and the eventual decline of the northern cities and the fragmented late pre-Columbian period, and the Spanish conquest and the colonial period, and the Spanish conquest and the colonial period, and the centuries since. The numbers are striking and often go unstated in popular accounts of the Maya collapse. There are somewhere in the range of 6 to 7 million Maya people alive today, speaking more than 24 distinct Maya languages, living primarily in Guatemala and Mexico and Belize and Honduras, maintaining cultural traditions and community structures and relationships to the landscape that carry continuity with the classic period, even across all the ruptures that the intervening centuries have produced. The language situation of the contemporary Maya is worth describing briefly because it illustrates the depth of the continuity in ways that a political history cannot. More than 24 distinct Maya languages are spoken today, descended from a Proto-Maya language that linguists have reconstructed as having been spoken in the highlands of Guatemala approximately 4,000 years ago, before the lowland classic florescence began. These languages have diversified over millennia in ways that make some of them mutually unintelligible, but they share grammatical structures and vocabulary that mark them unmistakably as members of the same family, and their continued vitality, in some communities growing rather than declining as younger generations make conscious choices to maintain the language, is one of the most remarkable cultural survival stories of the past few centuries. The speakers of Kich today are not speaking a reconstructed language. They are speaking a living tongue that their great-grandparents spoke, that goes back through unbroken transmission to the people who watched the classic cities empty and continued anyway. The archaeology of this continuity is equally striking. Ceramic traditions, the specific forms and decorative vocabularies of pottery production, show continuity across the classic to post-classic transition in ways that demonstrate population continuity rather than replacement. The same people or their descendants making the same kinds of things in modified forms, rather than a new population arriving and creating a new material culture from scratch. Agricultural practices documented in the colonial period as characteristic of Maya communities show deep structural similarities to the classic period agricultural evidence, suggesting that the farming knowledge that had sustained the classic cities was not lost but adapted and maintained through the dispersal and reorganization of the terminal classic period. The Maya did not start over. They continued in different forms, in different places, under different political arrangements, but in recognizable continuity with what had come before. The contemporary Maya are not a remnant population preserving a dying tradition. They are a living cultural presence of considerable size and diversity, and the communities that maintain Maya languages and practices are doing so not as archaeological exercises, but as expressions of ongoing identity. The people of highland Guatemala, who speak Kaish or Cachiquel or Mam, the communities of the Yucatan, who speak Yucatec Maya, the Lacandan people of Chiapas, who maintained a version of classic Maya religious practice in relative isolation well into the 20th century. All of these represent a continuity that runs back through the colonial period and through the post-classic and through the classic period itself, all the way to the people who built Tikal and Copan and watched them empty. The collapse of the classic Maya cities of the southern lowlands was not the end of the Maya. It was not even, in the longest view, the most important thing that happened to them. The Maya survived the 9th century and the 10th and the 11th and the long catastrophe of European contact and the deliberate destruction of their books and the systematic assault on their languages and their religions and their self-understanding, and they are still here. Millions of them, speaking dozens of Maya languages, carrying in their families and their communities a continuity that runs back not to the collapse but through it. To the people who built the cities and watched the cities empty and walked away and continued, as people do, to be alive. And that is where the story of the Maya collapse arrives. Not at an ending, but at a continuation. Not at the silence of a civilization destroyed, but at the silence of a civilization redistributed. The great cities of the south abandoned, and the forest reclaiming them, and the people who had built them moving on to different places and different arrangements that carried forward more than the ruins. Left Behind might suggest we have traveled from the height of the classic period, through the wars and the drought and the long unwinding, through the terminal silence of the southern cities and the northern fluorescence that followed, to the fact of the Maya today, millions of people still speaking dozens of languages, still counting the days in a calendar that the classic kings used to track the movements of Venus. Let us come back now to where we began, to the pattern in the early morning, to the mist and the bird song and the stone above the canopy. The mist is still in the trees, and the birds are still making their noise, and the temple is still there above the canopy, exactly as it was before the story began, which is the most truthful thing that can be said about what the ruins of the Maya lowlands are. They are still there, unchanged by the telling, indifferent to interpretation, patient in the way that only stone and jungle together can be patient. What has changed, or what this story has tried to change, is not the ruins, but the understanding of them. The sense of what it means to look at a place that held so much and then went so quiet, and to sit with the answer that the quiet gives, which is not the answer of ending, but the answer of transformation, of a world that could not hold its shape and let the shape go and continued in other form. SASA. The particular quality of the classic Maya ruins is unlike the quality of ruins that ended in fire or conquest. There were no conquerors here, no foreign army that arrived one morning and unmade what had been built over centuries. What came for the classic cities was slower and less legible than conquest, a combination of pressures that the cities could absorb individually but not simultaneously, and the result was not destruction but abandonment, which is a different thing. Destroyed cities leave evidence of the moment of their ending, burned structures, bodies in unusual places, the archaeology of sudden discontinuity. Abandoned cities leave evidence of a long, gradual diminishment, ceramics that change slowly in style over generations, structures that fall into disrepair and are cannibalized for building material, middens that thin out and stop. The classic Maya cities show the archaeology of abandonment, not destruction, which means there was no mourning when everything ended. There was a sequence of mornings, on each of which a few more people decided that the prospects were better somewhere else. There is a tendency in popular accounts of the Maya collapse to use the word collapse as though it was synonymous with destruction, as though a civilization that stops producing the particular kinds of records by which we track its existence has ceased in some fundamental way. The inscriptions stop. The monument building stops. The large-scale construction stops. The political hierarchies that organized the cities dissolve. And all of this is true, and all of it is genuinely significant. But the population did not stop. The people who had been living in Tikal and Copan and the dozens of other major cities of the southern lowlands did not simply cease to exist when their cities in Sistaway wound down. They moved. They reorganized. They established new communities in the northern lowlands and in the highlands, and in the smaller towns and farming villages of the peripheral zones that had always existed alongside the major cities. The collapse was not a demographic catastrophe in the sense of mass death, though there is evidence of population decline and of the nutritional stress that high population and food insecurity produce. It was a reorganization, a shift from one mode of social organization to another, driven by conditions that made the old mode unsustainable. This is worth sitting with because it changes the emotional register of what the ruins are. If the cities had been destroyed, they would be monuments to catastrophe, sites of a specific and datable violence that you could imagine and grieve. Since they were abandoned, they are something stranger, monument to a decision made cumulatively by hundreds of thousands of people over the course of a century, each decision individually reasonable, the cumulative effect transforming a landscape of living cities into a landscape of stone and forest. The ruins are the physical residue of a vast collective withdrawal, and standing in them now, you are standing inside the space left by millions of people who left not in panic, but in the slow, calculated way that people leave when they have concluded, over years of bad seasons and rising insecurity, that staying is no longer the better choice. The forest has its own relationship to the ruins that has nothing to do with grief or meaning. It simply grows. It has been growing back into these spaces since the first household was abandoned and the first courtyard was left unswept, and it will continue growing as long as the climate allows. The trees that have pushed their roots to the plazas and split the platforms of temples and grown tall enough to shade the stairways that kings climbed for ceremonies are not making a statement. They are doing what trees do in cleared land when the clearing stops. The relationship between the ruins and the forest is not symbolic. It is just biological, a landscape returning to a prior state at the pace that vegetative succession allows. That it looks meaningful to us is our problem, or our gift, depending on how you want to hold it. The inscriptions are the most direct bridge between the classic Maya world and our understanding of it. And there is something almost vertiginous about the fact that they can now be read at all. The classic Maya inscriptions are not simple records. They are highly formal literary productions, organized according to sophisticated conventions of syntax and meter and rhetorical arrangement, recording the events of royal lives in a language that combined historical reporting with theological interpretation in ways that do not always separate cleanly. The language of the inscriptions is classical Chalti, a Maya language that no one speaks as their native tongue today, but that is related closely enough to several living Maya languages that the decipherment process was able to use those languages as interpretive keys. Reading a classic Maya inscription is not simply a matter of mapping symbols to sounds. It requires an understanding of the specific literary conventions of the classic period, the standard phrases used to describe accession to the throne or the capture of an enemy or the witnessing of an astronomical event, the specific calendar systems used to record dates, the iconographic vocabulary that works in tandem with the text to create a complete meaning. It is a specialized skill that takes years to develop, and the community of scholars who can do it fluently numbers only in the dozens. The inscriptions are being read, but slowly, and the work is far from complete. What this means for our understanding of the collapse is that we have detailed biographical information about the rulers of perhaps 2 or 3 dozen major classic Maya cities, and much less about the hundreds of smaller sites whose inscriptions, if they produced formal inscriptions at all, have not survived or have not yet been read. The picture we have of the classic Maya political world is heavily weighted toward the most powerful and most literate centers, the cities that produced the most ambitious monuments and that had the stone and the skilled carvers to make them. The experience of smaller communities, of the farmers and craftspeople who made up the vast majority of the classic Maya population, comes to us not through the inscriptions, but through the more anonymous evidence of the archaeological record, and the interpretation of that evidence is always more uncertain than the interpretation of a named historical text. The inscriptions are the most direct bridge between the classic Maya world and our understanding of it, and the story of how they came to be read is itself a story worth briefly inhabiting. For roughly 1,000 years after the last classic inscriptions were carved, the Maya writing system was either unknown to the outside world or known only in fragments. The subject of speculation and occasional misguided interpretation that attributed the monuments to Egyptians or Phoenicians or other Old World civilizations whose architects Europeans found more plausible as builders of sophistic, emptied structures. The intellectual resistance to accepting that indigenous Americans had independently developed a sophisticated writing system ran deep in 19th and early 20th century scholarship, and it distorted the interpretation of Maya monuments for decades in ways that pushed back the serious work of decipherment. The correction of that distortion, through the patient philological work of scholars like Proskoryakov and Yuri Hinorisov, and Michael Coe and David Stewart and many others, is one of the great intellectual recoveries of the modern era. Not the recovery of a lost civilization in the romantic sense, but the recovery of a lost civilization in the romantic sense, but the recovery of the voices of a civilization that had been present all along in its monuments, waiting for readers capable of hearing them. What the ruins preserve, despite the forest and despite the centuries, is a record of human intention at a particular scale and moment. The orientation of the temples to astronomical events is still there. The alignment of the El Castillo at Chichen Itza to the equinox still producing its serpent shadow every spring and autumn. The observatories at other sites still pointing to the risings and settings of particular stars. The intentions of the builders encoded in the geometry of what they made in ways that do not require the builders to be present to communicate. The inscriptions are still there where the stone has not been taken or weathered past legibility, recording the names and deeds of kings who died 12 centuries ago in a language that is now being read again after a millennium of silence. The intention to be understood persists in the structure of things, even when the structures have been standing unattended in a rainforest for 1,000 years. The question that the ruins do not answer, that the sediment cores and the tree rings and the inscriptions all circle around without resolving, is what it felt like from the inside. We can reconstruct the pressures, we can document the timing. We can trace the political fragmentation and the drought signal and the population dispersal through the archaeological record with increasing precision. What we cannot do is inhabit the experience of a person living through the collapse of their world, because the experience of living through the collapse of a complex civilization is not documented in the records that survive. The records that survive are the records of royal authority, of the political system at the moment when it was still capable of producing records. The experience of the farmer watching his fields fail, the experience of the craftsman in the city as the market contracts, the experience of the young person growing up in a place that is visibly less than it was in the stories the elders tell. These experiences are in the archaeological record only obliquely, embedded in the skeletal evidence of nutritional stress and the settlement patterns of dispersal. They are not in any text we can read. The incompleteness of the record is, in a strange way, part of the record. Every archive has gaps, and the gaps in an archive tell you something about the conditions under which the archive was produced and maintained. The classic Maya archive is heavily weighted toward the public and the official and the durable, toward things that were deliberately made to last and deliberately placed where they would be seen. What it contains very little of is the informal, the private, the ephemeral, the ordinary. No classic Maya household object has survived that we can confidently identify as something made for personal use rather than institutional or ritual purposes. No correspondence survives. No personal letters or private records, because such documents, if they existed, would have been written on perishable materials that the humid tropical climate has destroyed without exception. The archive we have is the archive of power, of the monumental and the official, and the experience of the vast majority of people who lived in the classic Maya cities is recoverable only through the residue of their daily activities, rather than through any document they left about themselves. This is worth sitting with, not because it is unique to the Maya. It is true of virtually all ancient civilizations, in different proportions, but because it is particularly striking in the Maya case, where the sophistication of the available record makes the gaps more visible, and where the gap between what we know about the kings and what we know about everyone else is so wide that it can feel like the two categories of people lived in entirely different historical universes despite occupying the same cities at the same time. The sophistication of the inscription program, the deliberate and expensive effort to record the deeds of rulers in durable stone for posterity, was itself a form of historical exclusion, a choice about what was worth preserving that has shaped the history we are able to tell. The ordinary people of classic Maya civilization did not make that choice. It was made for them by the political system whose interests the inscription served, and the result is a record of the classic period that is rich in the texture of royal life and almost silent on everything else. We know the names of dozens of classic Maya kings. We know the dates of their accessions and their military victories and their deaths. We know something of the theological frameworks within which they understood their own authority. And we know almost nothing from any source about the experience of the people who carried the stones that built the temples those kings commissioned, who farmed the fields that fed the cities those kings ruled, who had children and buried them and watched the world they knew becoming less than it had been, and who eventually made the decision to go somewhere else and did, and became the ancestor, ours, of the millions of Maya people who are alive today. The silence of the ordinary record is not something that scholarship can fully repair, but it is something worth acknowledging, worth holding carefully alongside the richness of the inscription corpus, as a reminder that the history we have is always a partial history, that the civilization we are trying to understand was considerably larger and more varied and more fully human than the monuments by which we know it today. This incompleteness is not a failure of the scholarship. It is a property of the record. Ancient civilizations generally leave records of their most powerful and most institutionalized activities, and very little of ordinary life, and the classic Maya are not unusual in this respect, only particularly vivid in the contrast between the elaborate public record of the inscriptions and the relative silence of the private and everyday. What the inscriptions give us is a civilization at its most articulate, at its most self-conscious, producing deliberate statements about itself for posterity. What the archaeology of the collapse gives us is something more like the residue of a civilization at its most overwhelmed, the evidence left by people who were no longer in a position to produce deliberate statements about anything, but were still, in the most fundamental sense, surviving. What the story of the Maya collapse ultimately resists is the narrative arc we instinctively reach for when we tell stories about historical endings. We want a moment of culmination, a before and an after with a clear line between them, a villain or a catastrophe or a decision that can bear the weight of explanation. The Maya collapse offers none of these with any reliability. The wars were real, but they did not deliver a knockout blow. The drought was real, but it did not simply kill the cities. The political fragmentation was real, but it was as much a consequence of the stress as a cause of it. What we have instead is a system that was operating under accumulating pressure for several generations, and that eventually, across different cities at different rates over a period of roughly a century and a half, crossed some threshold below which it could no longer sustain itself, and what had been a city became a town, became a village, became a ruin, became a forest. No single moment, no single cause. A long unwinding that left no definitive record of its own logic. This is, as a historical explanation, genuinely unsatisfying if you approach it expecting the clarity of simple causation, and it is genuinely illuminating if you approach it with the patience to understand something complex on its own terms. The Maya collapse is one of the best documented examples in the archaeological record of how complex, highly organized societies can fail. Not through some single spectacular failure, but through the compounding of ordinary stresses that individually manageable systems cannot collectively absorb. That it happened in the rainforest of Central America more than 1,200 years ago does not make it less instructive as a case study in how fragile the conditions for civilizational complexity actually are. How many things have to be working simultaneously and in coordination for a large, elaborate, resource-intensive social system to sustain itself. What the story of the Maya collapse ultimately resists is the narrative arc we instinctively reach for when we tell stories about historical endings. We want a moment of culmination, a before and an after, with a clear line between them, a villain or a catastrophe or a decision that can bear the weight of explanation. The Maya collapse offers none of these with any reliability. What the ruins are quieter in the afternoon. The bird song changes register as the day heats up, some species retreating into the deeper forest, others taking their place, and the mist that was rising at dawn has long since burned off, leaving the stone hot to the touch and the air heavy with moisture and the smell of vegetation in full photosynthetic operation. The forest here is extraordinarily productive, pulling carbon from the air and building it into structure with an efficiency that is almost industrial in its scale. And the ruins are simply part of the structure that the forest builds around and over and through, incorporated into a biological system that has no particular opinion about what the limestone was used for before it became substrate for. Our roots and moss and the patient work of weather, the particular combination of the monumental and the botanical that characterizes the Maya ruins, is the result of a very specific set of convergent circumstances that are worth naming explicitly. The classic Maya built primarily in stone and fired lime plaster, materials that are extremely durable in the absence of freeze-thaw cycles that would crack and fragment them, and the Petan lowlands have no freezing winters, so the stone survives essentially intact across millennia. But the Maya built in a climate that is also ideal for vegetation, and the combination of heat and moisture and the absence of a prolonged dry season creates conditions in which vegetative succession happens continuously and with remarkable speed. A cleared plot of land in the Petan will have a young forest growing over it within a decade if left alone. A building with a damaged roof will have tree roots through its floors within a generation. The same climate that makes the stone last forever makes the forest inescapable, and the result is the specific quality that the Maya ruins have: massive structures in essentially sound condition being slowly and continuously dismantled by biological systems that are operating at full efficiency and have no particular urgency about their work, doing in centuries what will eventually, across millennia, reduce everything to substrate. There is something about this combination that resists the conventional pathos of ruins. European ruins, in the tradition that shaped the Romantic response to decay, tend to be structures in cold or temperate climates. where the agent of destruction is time and weather and human neglect, and the aesthetic of the ruin is the aesthetic of slow fragmentation, stones falling, arches collapsing, the gradual return of the structure to its constituent materials. The Maya ruins are different because they are not fragmenting in that way. The stones are largely intact. The arches are often sound. What is happening is not fragmentation, but incorporation. The forest growing around and through the structures rather than breaking them apart. And the result is not the melancholy of something destroyed, but the peculiar vitality of something being absorbed, which is a more ambiguous and in some ways a more interesting thing to stand in the middle of. The particular combination of the monumental and the botanical that characterizes the classic Maya ruins is unlike almost anything else in the archaeological world. The temples at Angkor Wat in Cambodia have a similar quality. Great stone structures being slowly and continuously disassembled by the root systems of giant trees. But Angkor has always been more accessible to visitors and better maintained, and its quality is somewhat different. The Mesoamerican ruins have a specific dense humidity to them, a sense of being inside a system of biological production that has been running at full intensity since the Ice Ages that makes the stone feel less like architecture and more like geology. Less like something humans put here and more like geology. Less like something humans put here and more like something that grew here and was later modified by Aga in. Standing in the pattern at any time of day, you are aware that you are inside a living system that is larger and older and more indifferent than anything the kings who built these temples were trying to express. And the relationship between what the Maya built and what the forest is doing to it now is part of what the place is, not a vandalism, but a continuation. The stones are warm in the afternoon sun. The temple is still there. The forest is still growing. The air is alive with insects and birdsong and the drip of water somewhere in the trees. The light is changing. The shadows are lengthening toward the east. The day is ending, the way days have ended here since before there was anyone to watch them end. The mist will be back tomorrow morning. It always comes back. The jungle moves at its own pace. It has been moving since before the cities were built. And it will be moving long after the last archaeologist has packed their instruments and driven away down the rutted road. The trees that have grown through the plazas do not know they are growing through plazas. The roots that have split the stones do not know they are splitting stones. The forest does not remember what was here. It simply grows, as it has always grown, into whatever space is available. The stone is still warm from the afternoon sun. In a few hours, it will cool, the way it has cooled every night for 1,200 years. Since the last person who had reason to stand on these steps stood here and looked out at the same forest and understood something that we are still trying to understand. The kings are gone. The calendar priests are gone. The markets and the roads and the ceremonies are gone, but the forest is the same forest, and the mist is the same mist, and somewhere in the communities of Guatemala and Mexico and Belize, the people whose great-great-grandparents built these steps are still here, still speaking the language, still counting the days. The jungle moves. The stone holds. The morning comes again. Thank you for spending this night in the rainforest with the Maya. If this is the kind of company you keep at this hour, subscribing to the channel means the next story will be waiting whenever you are ready. There is always another city in the trees, another silence worth sitting with, another civilization that did not end so much as change its shape. Sleep well.